Hey, welcome back to another episode of A Warrior Spirit, where we let the inner warrior shine in their light. Today, I'm honored to be with Mr. Bear Bangs. Bear is a belief coach. He's also an ordained minister, and just an all-around great-hearted man. And I'm just thrilled that you've come on. And I do want the audience to know your true name is Bear.
It
So,
is.
they don't have to get Bear. Yeah, your true name is Bear, correct?
It is. It is.
I've been in the coaching space for a while and I've seen a wide variety of coaches, but I've never heard of a belief coach. What is the theory
So
behind that?
yeah, so I probably it's been about 8 or 9 months ago. I was noticing, as I was kind of expanding my reach, if you will, of just talking with folks and having conversations and really listening to a lot of people, whether it was their videos, whether it's reels that they were doing, whatever the case might be. I noticed a dearth, and I love that word, a dearth of belief. It's really dearth is just a lack, but I love the word dearth. But just this lack of belief that people had in themselves, and they're great at believing in others. They're great at believing in their creator, whatever form that might be, believing in universal principles, all of these different things. But what I noticed was that they were having a hard time believing in themselves. And I had so many people reach out to me and they're like, "Hey, you're a pretty confident dude. How do you believe in yourself?" And I thought about it and I said, "I'm going to become the belief coach." And I like to say I kind of created this tagline, if you will, and that is that I speak belief into others until that belief comes out of them, because it's a trained skill, if you will. We train ourselves throughout our lives. A lot of times when I have conversations with folks and I say, why do you have such a hard time believing in yourself? And two common responses. One, well, I've never really done anything, is the first response. But the second is often, well, my parents told me never to brag. And then
Mhm.
if I was bragging about myself or talking about myself, then I was bragging.
Mhm.
And it's a sense of pride, and we can't take pride in ourselves.
Right.
And I'm like, okay, wait a second, that's not the pride they're talking about,
Right.
but I understand where you're coming from. And so that's really where that came about, was just that sense that people were having a hard time believing in themselves and in their ability.
Well, I appreciate that because the world needs more of it. Now, in the 7 or 8 or 9 months that I've known you to be a pretty gregarious. We'll throw out some big words here today since we're both wordsmiths.
Right.
A pretty gregarious, outgoing individual, larger than life, some would say, but also a very generous, giving heart. Like I've seen you just pour into people for the sake of pouring into people, and that's in and of itself amazing. But were you that way as a child? Is that something you always tapped into, or what was it like growing up as Bear?
uh Apparently I was a pretty outgoing guy, and but I wasn't. And so it's actually really interesting. I was having a conversation with a classmate of mine that I graduated with, oh, so many years ago. And I won't tell people what year I graduated from high school, because my classmates are getting kind of old and I don't want to, kind of throw them under the bus. But I was having a conversation with a classmate of mine, and this classmate was asking me, you know, in high school, I know that you were this guy. I mean, you were just Bear, but what was it like for you? Well, for me, my dad and we moved to a new town right before I started high school. And so I didn't go to elementary school or junior high with all of the kids that all knew each other, that had already formed all of their little cliques and everything else.
Mhm.
And so I was kind of this outsider. But the nice thing about being the outsider was that it kind of allowed me to pour myself into all of the groups, all of the cliques. I wasn't a jock, I was a band geek and a choir nerd and a drama dork and all of those different names. Uh, but it but being that outsider, I never really fit in, which was actually okay, because it didn't pigeonhole me into one particular group or clique. But I've had a couple of experiences with people from high school, and I shared part of my story. Oh gosh, probably right when the pandemic hit. I started doing more video, and I shared a part of my story about some of the abuse that I faced from a stepdad that my mom was married to in my early years. And one of my classmates, when I did a video about some of that abuse, reached out to me, and she's like, "Oh my gosh, I never knew that you went through any of that as a kid. But what I do remember about you is that there was one day I was having a really tough day, and you came over to me and you said something that completely lifted my spirits. And knowing now what I know about your past, I never would have guessed, based on, some of the stereotypes of trauma and abuse victims, if you will. Knowing that about you now, I never would have guessed that you faced that, because you were always just this positive person." And had another one reach out to me a few years ago, and she was like, "Did you make your million yet?" I'm like, "What are you talking about?" He said, "Well, one day in 10th grade, you said that by the time you were 40 years old, you were going to be retired and you were going to be a millionaire." And I'm like, "Well, I actually did retire at 40, not as a millionaire, but I did retire from kind of actively working, if you will." And so, yeah, I would say, based on those external, pieces of feedback, that I guess I was a pretty outgoing ish guy, and with a name like Bear, you kind of step into it, right?
Yeah.
Because it kind of forces you to step into that.
So why, and I'm sure you've answered this question your entire life, why did they name you Bear?
So my parents were kind of outdoorsy. They weren't hippies or anything like that. I will put out there, I was born in Oregon, but my parents weren't like the typical Oregon hippies. It wasn't anything like that, but they were outdoorsy. My dad hunted and fished, and things like that. Well, when my mom was 8 months pregnant with me, they decided, "Hey, let's go camping." Because, when you're 8 months pregnant, why wouldn't you go camping, I
Sure.
guess, right? So, uh,
My mom went roller skating. Here's what
yeah, there you go. Yeah. Well, while they were camping, my mom went to go behind a tree to do what you do when you're behind a tree. And about 50 yards away, a bear walked by, and it scared her so bad that she went into labor. And I'm totally lying. That is not at all where my name came from. But it is a story that I made up about 5 years ago. I was at a bank teller, and she was like, "Where'd you come up with that name?" And I told her, and she bought it hook, line, and sinker. And
Just
I'm like,
like I did.
I'm telling that story from now on. But the real story is, my dad, from when he was in high school, he said, I want to have a son, but I want his name to be Bear, because he used to like to say all the Bills, Mikes, Bobs, and Johns were already taken. And he said, I want my son to have a unique name and a strong name, and Bear, just, that was it. That was the name that he wanted his son to have.
Can you imagine if you'd have been a scrawny, thin little guy? Like,
So, so my funny story. So my
true story or
legal,
not?
no, true story, true story. So yeah, it's all true stories from here on out. I always use the mom behind the tree thing as
Yeah.
kind of an icebreaker, but then I'm like, no, it's a lie, but the rest
Yeah.
of this is true. Uh, but no, my dad actually, when they submitted the paperwork to the lady at the hospital to then submit to the state, they put Bear Brandon Bangs on the paperwork. Well, the lady at the hospital didn't like the way that sounded. So before she submitted it to the state, she flipped it. And so when my birth certificate came back, it came back as Brandon Bear. And my parents were like, "We don't care. You're always going to be Bear. That's all there is to it." Well, years later, they realized it was kind of a pain, because, registering for school, they had to put Brandon. When I got my driver's license, we had to put Brandon. And, when I enlisted in the Army, all my records say Brandon. But my parents were like, "We don't care. It's going to be Bear. That's it, period." So it's always been Bear. Uh, but my dad always said, if I was going to be a jock, or if I was going to be, professional football player, because that was kind of his dream for me was to maybe one day be a professional football player. Then Bear works. He said if I was going to be a doctor or a lawyer or someone in a more educated profession, then I could use Brandon if I wanted to, because it kind of has that more educated feel to it. And so I'm like, no, it's just always been Bear. That's there was a 2 week period in seventh grade where I was like, I think I'm going to go by Brandon, and it didn't work at all. And so, yeah, it's other than those 2 weeks, it's always been Bear.
How long? I'm so glad that it's Bear because you've more fit the Bear.
Yeah.
Um,
Right.
how long were you in the service?
I spent 12 years in the Army.
Okay.
I was went to college, left the house for college after high school, lasted a semester, ended up marrying my, well, now ex-wife, but my first wife, after that first semester, and trying to do the family thing and go to college and do all that stuff. Honestly, 12 years of school was kind of enough for me at that point. And, so yeah, did a semester at Boise State, and then started a family. And after about 2.5 years, we were really struggling. And my dad called me and he said, that recruiter from high school is still calling, like all the time. He calls me all the time just to check up on you. Will you call him just so he quits bugging me? And so I called the recruiter, and, long story short, ended up enlisting in the Army, mostly to take care of my family. And so, yeah, spent 12 years playing that Army game, and something I'll always be proud of, and won't always look back on every moment fondly, but overall it was a good experience.
Well, thank you for your service.
Thank
My
you.
daughter is in the Navy, and I have an affinity. My dad was in the Army. So I have an affinity for military, and I appreciate your service, and thank you for all you did.
Thank you.
When I first met you, you had the fortune to sit on stage with Dean Graziosi and a Tony Robbins event that I was at, and you told a really heartwarming story about your father. Can you please share that with my audience again?
Absolutely. Absolutely. When I was 27 years old, my hero, my bedridden hero, my dad, uh, sent me to the pharmacy to pick up some prescriptions for him. And 3 days later, he used those pills to take his life. And when I say that my dad was my hero, I mean that in every single sense of the word. He was my hero. He was my best friend. He, there wasn't a Sunday that went by, no matter where I was in the world, there wasn't a Sunday that went by that I didn't talk to my dad. We talked for sometimes 20 minutes. I think the shortest we ever talked was 10 minutes when I was in basic training, but we would talk for sometimes 3 or 4 hours. Every Sunday, we didn't miss a Sunday. And so, like I said, when I say that he was my best friend, my hero, everything, he was that. And a lot of people over the years, when someone takes their own life, the family that's left is a lot of times, left to kind of pick up the pieces, if you will. But my dad, like I said, also said he was bedridden. 3 months before he took his life, he had a necrotizing fasciitis, which is that flesh-eating bacteria you
Mhm.
sometimes hear about in the news. They ended up amputating one of his legs. Uh, there wasn't a day in my life, in my up to that point 27 years, that I hadn't seen my dad in pain. He was a football player in school, tore his body up playing football. Then he worked in the oil fields in northern Alaska, out in the Arctic Circle. Just telling me stories about being out in the oil fields, and 100 degrees below zero, 80-mile-an-hour winds, just ridiculous stuff. Drove a meat truck. And so he was carrying like 250, 300-pound sides of beef on his shoulders, getting in and out of the back of these semis. And, so he was a blue collar guy for sure. And it didn't matter though, because he still loved me. But like I said, there wasn't a day in my life that I didn't see my dad in pain. And he had an open casket at his funeral. And was the first time in my life that I hadn't seen my dad in pain. And so when he took his life, there were a few of those emotions that, we hear a lot of people talk about, the anger and the hurt and the frustration and, all of those things. But for me, it was a sense of relief, because when I looked down at my dad in his casket, it was the first, like I said, it was the first time that I looked at him that he wasn't in pain. And when I talk about pain, I'm talking about just excruciating pain. He had to take 27 pills every single morning just to get out of bed. He was up to about 39 pills a day just to function. And when I talk about functioning, I'm talking about just to be able to get out of bed. And this was before the amputation, but just to get out of bed, to roll out. He had all of those pills by his bedside. And that was, he would take his literally fistful of pills, have his glass of water, swallow them all down, and then he'd have to lay in bed for 30 minutes to an hour just for all of them to kick in. And then he would get up, go make himself some breakfast, sit in his recliner, and kind of let breakfast settle in. And then throughout the day, it was more pain pills, more different things, just to leave the house, go to the grocery store, or leave the house and go to the post office. And so his quality of life for many years was virtually non-existent. And so, yeah, it was one of those things that, a lot of times, and I've heard all of the cliches about suicide. I've heard all of the cliches about, what it is, but it has definitely opened my eyes to so many different things and so many different facets to it. And, I've spent a lot of time talking with folks who have lost a parent to suicide or lost a loved one to suicide. And, a lot of times it's, oh, we had no idea. We had no idea that they were in that much pain. We had no idea that they, were at that point or whatever. And I did. I did know how my dad was feeling, and like I said, we talked every Sunday, but we also talked about everything. There weren't any secrets between father and son. And so, yeah, it was hard. There was part of me that was angry with him for a little while, because my daughters at the time were, let's see, my youngest was 4, almost 5, and my oldest had just turned 8. And so all of a sudden they don't have grandpa, and I waited. I waited about 18 years before I told my daughters the truth about how grandpa left this world. And it ended up being a great conversation. My dad asked me, and I'm very much a believer in honor thy father and thy mother. But my dad asked me, he said, don't tell anybody, because of the shame and the guilt that come along with that decision. But he also didn't want to be looked down upon, if you will. And so I held on to that secret. My first wife, I had, obviously told her, told my daughters 18 years later, and I told my current wife, and those were the only people who knew. But last year, well, let me back up. November of 20, was it 2019? Yeah, November of 19. I went to an event, a public speaking event, and crafted that sentence. When I was 27 years old, my bedridden hero, my dad, sent me to the pharmacy, and I crafted that sentence at that event. And it was the first time I'd ever said it out loud in front of 100 other public speakers. And when people talk about, you could hear a pin drop in the room, and we were in a theater in La Jolla, California. And when I said it, you could literally hear a pin drop. And I knew at that moment the story needed to be told. And I waited and I sat on it for a couple of years, sat on it for a couple of years. And then finally last year, as we came upon the 20th anniversary of his passing, I said, you know what, the story needs to be told. And it needs to be told in a way to help those who are still here, so that the shame, the guilt, all of those things aren't continued to be felt. Because my dad, I know he didn't want me to tell anybody to protect his name, but he also didn't want me to tell anybody to protect me. Because there's always that, not always, there's often the stigma around it. And he's like, there's going to be a stigma if you tell people. And at this point now, I'm like, you know what, enough time has passed. But I also know that by telling it, he's proud of me, because it gives me the opportunity to help others who feel that guilt and shame and the stigmas that come with it.
Well, it also allows you to heal fully from it
Mhm.
because you've had to carry that for so long. It begs a couple of questions. First off, how old were you when your parents split up? Because you
Uh,
mentioned the abuse from your stepfather.
yeah, so I was 5 when my parents divorced,
Okay.
and this was the early '80s,
Okay.
and back then, mom always got custody.
Yep.
It's just how it was. And in a lot of ways now, I know that it's very similar. But yeah, so went to live with mom. Shortly after they were divorced, she married a guy who was not a good person. But yeah,
So did you have siblings?
yeah, I have an older sister. I guess technically she's a half sister, but we had same mom, different dads. When
Okay.
she was 3, my dad ended up actually adopting her. So yeah, she's my sister.
Okay.
But yeah,
So did she endure the same abuse you did?
yeah, yeah. It was pretty horrific. A lot of things. I saw a lot of things and heard a lot of things that no 5 to 9 year old should ever have to hear.
Yep.
A lot of things that were directed at her. It was a lot of emotional as well as physical. Like I said, my stepdad at the time, not a good person. And I have a firm belief that 99.99999% of people are good people. And in fact, I used to work at a challenge course, like a ropes course, did a lot of team building with corporations and different groups and organizations. And we would have people self-identify as good people. And 99.99999% of those people would raise their hands saying, yeah, I'm a good person. I don't always make the best decisions, but I'm still a good person. And that stepdad, not a good person.
So it's amazing that you were and are such a generous giving person. Coming from that background and that environment, that speaks volumes to you as a person as well. Um, what w- it's not uncommon for suicide. It's
Mhm.
uncommon to ask your son to help you and tell you what you're going to do with it. It's one
Mhm.
thing to say, hey, go get my prescription. It's
Right.
another thing to have the entire conversation that he had around it. What in you, other than love of father, even said yes?
That's one question that I've asked myself a lot. Um, and really what it boils down to was, my dad was a very proud man. And when I talked about pride earlier, he was a proud man, not always in the best of ways. My dad also was the type of person that he could hold a grudge. And when I talk about he could hold a grudge, I mean he could hold a grudge. Uh, but I also knew that the conversation that we had around it, and I'll back up a little bit. After he had his amputation, and funny story about that, I'm not going to go into that story, but there's actually a really funny story about that. But after his leg was amputated, he spent some time in a rehabilitation facility. And while he was in that rehabilitation facility on a Friday night, and I was stationed in Hawaii at the time, and he's in Central Oregon. I get a phone call from the rehabilitation facility that your dad is unresponsive. He's not responding to any treatment. His eyes or his pupils are basically fixed and dilated, and we're just counting down until we call you to let him know or let you know that he's passed. And I said, okay, thank you very much. The next morning, I get a phone call on my caller ID, it's the facility. I answer the phone and I hear, hey, what's up, bud? It was my dad. And I'm like, wait a second, why are you calling me? You're not supposed to be the one calling me. He's like, what are you talking about? And I'm like, they called me last night and said that you were, for all intents and purposes, you were gone. He's like, well, I was sleeping pretty deeply, but that's about it. I'm like, okay, big guy. Well, a few days later, the facility called me and they said, your dad's not accepting any rehab treatment, anything like that. We're going to have to discharge him because Medicare won't pay since he's refusing treatment. So you're going to have to come get him. So I jumped on a space available flight from Hawaii and flew into Travis Air Force Base in Sacramento, rented a car, drove up, took dad home. And that's when dad told me, he said, hey, I need you to put my pistol in this end table right here, or in this nightstand. And when you go back home to Hawaii, we were getting him home, set up with home health and everything else. And he said, when you go back home to Hawaii, I'm just going to go ahead and take care of it. My dad, with his pride, was the type of guy, he was a working man. When he was medically retired, it hurt his pride a lot. Deep depression set in, just all of these different things. But he was such a prideful person, or such a proud person, that he used to often joke. He would say, if I ever get to the point where I can't wipe my own, you can fill in the rest. He would actually say the word, but yeah. He said, if I get to the point where I can't wipe myself, just take me out behind the barn and finish me off. And he would say it half joking, but he meant it.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's why he wanted me to put his pistol in the nightstand so that he could take care of it. And when he said that, I knew how serious he was. And I also know that if I would have called some sort of hotline, that would have been the end of our relationship. It was when I talk about how much of a grudge he held. When my sister and I went to go live with my dad after the abuse of my mom's house, about 3 months after we went to go live with dad, she took off and did a bunch of stuff, and he cut off all ties, cut off the relationship with her. They didn't have a relationship. She tried it a few times, and he was like, nope, don't want to have it. And so when I talk about holding a grudge, he was very much a grudge holder. And when I talk about the fact that he was my hero, a lot of times people think that as a hero that you're supposed to worship them. Well, I don't believe that. I believe that our heroes aren't infallible. They also have some traits that we don't necessarily have to agree with, but they can still be our heroes. My dad's pride and his grudge holding were not good. The way he held grudges, I know how toxic it became in his body, all of those different things. But when he told me that, or when he asked me to put the pistol in his nightstand, that's when I did stand up to him and I said, no, Dad, I'm not going to do it that way. And he's like, why not? I said, well, here's the thing. Number one, even if I'm in Hawaii when you do it, I'm going to have to come over and fly back over here and cover up bullet holes, cover up the scene, clean the scene, all of those different things. I'm like, I don't want to do that. Don't put me in that position. And there was a part of me that was hoping that he would be like, okay, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to end my life. There was a part of me, even though I knew that that wasn't it. And so he said, okay, that's fine. He said, take me to the doctor. So I took him to the doctor, And he sat down with the doctor and asked the doctor to prescribe him what could potentially do it. And they went in behind closed doors and he came out with prescriptions. And that's when I went to the pharmacy. But it was very much an either or type of situation. If I didn't take him to the doctor and get those prescriptions, then he would have just done it the way he wanted to do it from the beginning. And so it did put me between a rock and a hard place. And it put me further in between the rock and the hard place, because like I said, if I would have called a hotline, he would have done it anyway, but then I would have never heard about it because he would have cut off all ties and all anything with me.
So when do you think you recovered from that?
It was honestly, it was pretty quick. It was quick because the moment I looked at him in that casket, I was like, wow, okay, he's not in pain anymore. The physical, the emotional, all of those different pieces of him that were in pain were now gone. And because of that, that was probably the most cathartic piece to all of the healing. I wasn't ever mad at him because he had his reasons. I had several conversations with his doctor, especially after the fact. And he was a very, very depressed individual. But my dad was also a stubborn individual. And once he made his mind up with something, that's how it was going to be. And so by having a say in it, in how it was carried out, that was also a cathartic piece, because it wasn't a shock. It wasn't this, oh my gosh, I can't believe he did it. It was very much at least he didn't do it that way.
Yeah. Well, it's very altruistic and loving to having a father who lived his entire life in pain. I understand that element of it. And we're not just talking about a little ache or pain here. We're talking about
like
agony.
lifting his arms past here was excruciating. Yeah.
So I understand all of that. And it's actually coming up. By the time this airs, it'll be 4 years since my father passed away. And so I understand seeing the peace that they never experienced in their life.
Right.
So I understand that part. How do you take Bear from doing all that to ordained minister and coach?
So I'm going to back up a little bit.
Sure.
And I'm going to back up to that high school piece. Like I said, I've had several people approach me over the years, and they were like, "Oh my gosh, I remember you." 3 things happened when I was 15 years old, and they happened in very close succession. The first was, I got home from school one day, and my dad was watching Oprah on TV. Now, if you remember anything about daytime talk shows in the 80s and early 90s, they were a lot different than they are today. Back then, it was almost like they were looking for the most tragic stories. That I called it train wreck TV. And my dad never watched Oprah. So when I got home from school that day and all of a sudden Oprah's on, I'm like, why is he watching Oprah? This is weird. So I sit down. We each had a recliner. It was just he and I, at that point. And I sit down in my recliner, and he's sitting in his, and there is just this heart-wrenching story. It was someone who was abused as a child, and they're now 20 years past childhood, but they've been in and out of prison, in and out of rehab. And they were, talking about how their childhood was so damaging to them that they just couldn't get over it, and all of these things. Well, I said it out loud because I thought I had just said it in my own head, but it came out of my mouth hole, apparently. I was like, man, this is so sad. Well, my dad's recliner it was an old Lazy Boy. And if you remember the old Lazy Boys, they were spring loaded. And there was the
Mhm.
arm on the side, almost like a slot machine arm, right?
Yeah.
On the side. And dad had actually built a platform to put his, because this was before the electrical, or electric, Lazy Boys that lift you up and all of those things. We didn't have any of those things, but dad had built a platform out of cinder blocks and plywood and put his chair about a foot higher, about a foot off the ground, so that when his feet hit the ground, it was easy for him to just get out. Well, it also created this echo effect, because when that arm came forward on those Lazy Boys and the legs came down, all the springs inside the recliner activated all at the same time. And it was loud when it was sitting on the floor, but when it's
Mhm.
sitting up off of the floor, you could like hear it in the next area code, not the next zip
Right.
code, but the next area code.
Yeah.
Well, I remember saying, man, this is so sad. And all of a sudden I just hear chung, and feet come down, his feet hit the floor. And I look and I'm like, oh my gosh, what did I say? I look over at him, and not really in fear, but just kind of like, what did I just say that was wrong? And he said, and he looked me with probably up to that point the most sincere look that he had ever given me till then. And he said, you've had a pretty rough go of things up until this point. Because he obviously knew about all the stuff that had gone on before he regained custody. He said, you've had a pretty rough go at this point. He said, but right now you have a choice. In 20 years, you can be on Oprah because of your crappy childhood. Like I said, dad was blue collar. He didn't say crappy. He said the other one.
Yeah.
But he said, you can be on Oprah because of your crappy childhood or in spite of your crappy childhood. But the choice is yours. And in that moment, dad gave me, and I was 15, but dad gave me so much power in that moment, because then it was that moment. And some people go their whole lives without ever understanding that responsibility and the power of choice
Mhm.
is ours. But in that one sentence, dad gave me that power of choice and responsibility, that no matter what happens in my life, it doesn't have to be the past that dictates it. It can be the choices that I make from now and moving forward. And about a month later, he bought me for Christmas. My grades were terrible because I didn't care at that point. I didn't care about school, a lot of things. It was just like, I'll just go through the motions. But he bought me a program called Where There's a Will, There's an A. And it was this old VHS tape program by Dr. Claude Olney. And I think he was a professor at Arizona State University. And I watched that and I was like, oh, school can be easy. How about that? But then I had a moment with a teacher, Mrs. Curry. She was my 9th and 10th grade math teacher. Yes, they were separate math classes. It wasn't the same class in 9th and 10th grade. It was, geometry or algebra and then geometry.
Yeah.
But about halfway through my 10th grade year, I was having one of those, I was being a turd. I'll just put it that way. I was being a little jerk in her class. She told me to do something. I didn't want to do it. I told her no. She told me to do it again. I told her no. She told me to do it again. So then she sent me out into the hallway and got home from school that day. Dad was out in the garage working at his workbench. And I get home. I'm like, hey, Dad, how's it going? And nothing, not a word from dad. And usually if I didn't get a word from dad, I knew something was up. Either he'd had a bad day or I screwed up. And
Mhm.
so, yeah. So I'm like, did you hear me, Dad? How was your day? Nothing. Okay. I'm like, I'm not going to continue to trying to talk to dad. I'm just going to go in. And so I go in, or I start to go to the door leading from the garage into the house. I was like, all right, Dad, I'm going to go do my homework now. I never said I was going to go do my homework, but that day I was like, I probably better go do my homework.
Yeah.
And I reach for the door handle and I just hear him say, stop. And I turn around and by now he's looking at me. And I said, yeah, what's going on? And he's like, well, Mrs. Curry called today. I said, oh, yeah? She tell you I was doing pretty good in school? just playing it off. I knew why Mrs. Curry had called, but I was trying to play it off, trying to be that cool kid. And he was like, no, it wasn't good. And he said, she was crying. And I said, oh yeah. And he said, so here's what's going to happen. He said, my policy has always been what goes on at school goes on at school. What you do here, that affects me personally. I'll correct the behavior. If you do things at school, I'm going to let the school take care of it. He said, but in this case, you're going to go in tomorrow morning. You're going to go in early before school starts. And for me at 15, that was the biggest punishment, was having to get up early and go to school early. And he said, you're going to go in and you're going to track down Mrs. Curry. I don't care where you find her, but you're going to find her and you're going to apologize and you're going to mean it. All right, not a problem. He's like, now get inside and do your homework. I'm like, okay. So I actually went in and did my homework that day. But the next morning I got up early, went in, tracked Mrs. Curry down and found her. She was in her office. She was a math teacher, but her office was actually behind one of the science labs. It was weird. But I went in and I said, hey, Mrs. Curry, I apologize for being such a jerk yesterday. I'm really sorry. And she looked at me dead in the eye. And she said, Bear, sometimes we just have those days where we just have to say, F it. But she actually dropped the bomb. She didn't say F, she dropped it. And I had a lot of issues with women because of my mom and the situation that had happened, living with my mom and growing up with my mom. My dad had a lot of issues as well with women. And so a lot of his issues kind of came on to me as well. But when here's this woman in an authority position dropping the bomb, to every 15-year-old, it's like, oh my gosh, I can't believe she. And in the moment, I was like, wait, she can't say that. But then like an instant later, I was like, oh my gosh, that is so cool. She just said that. But what it did is it, again, kind of freed up that mind. And I was like, wow, she just said it. But more importantly, it's what she said, where we get to have those days. And so really those 3 moments at 15 years old led me down that path of personal development. At 17 years old, summer after I graduated from high school, I went to my first network marketing event or presentation, where it's, here's you and here's your 3 best friends and then their 3 best friends. But the name Tony Robbins came up in that network marketing presentation. And I was like, who's this Tony Robbins guy? And so I started, listening to some of his stuff, listening to Jim Rohn's stuff. And then I got more into network marketing and never really made a dime in network marketing, but the personal development side of things, listening to Tony and listening to Jim Rohn, listening to Zig Ziglar and Brian Tracy and, all of these people over the years. So that led me down that path. The ordained minister piece, actually, I had a friend who was getting married and asked me if I would perform their wedding ceremony. I said, yeah, sure, not a problem. Well, I was living in a state at the time where in order to perform a wedding ceremony, you had to have some sort of ordination. So I jumped online, got the little certificate and said, hey, I'm now an ordained minister. But that has opened up new avenues as well. Living where I live now, it's actually the only county in the world that facilitates online wedding ceremonies, but you have to be an ordained minister to be able to perform the wedding ceremony. So it's super cool because we're up to 38 countries now that I've performed, from here in my office and my studio. It's actually why I have the map behind me to remind me that we're just a big global family. But yeah, we're up to 38 countries now that I've been able to perform ceremonies for people who live in those countries while I'm right here in my office and studio. And so it's awesome. Yeah, being able to celebrate love, being able to celebrate all of that. And then going into coaching is really just kind of that natural path, if you will, going from the personal development world, all of the things that I've learned over those years, but then kind of putting my spin, my take, my experiences into those pieces.
Yeah, I'm a little further down the road than you. I will say my 40-year uh, high school anniversary or reunion was this year.
Right,
So I'm a little further down that road, but we studied, Zig Ziglar was the first. I still have the original cassette tape that I studied from Zig.
right.
Loved Ziglar. Then it progressed into Tony and John Maxwell and,
Mhm.
on and on. And now here we both are all these years later, helping others transform their lives as well. And, it's not those huge moments in our life that transform us. It's those little moments like what
Mhm.
your dad did with you. My father, I was 18, grew up, well, I was born in Minneapolis, but grew up in a small town in Iowa.
Mhm.
And my dad was also my hero. When he married my mother, prior to that, my biological father also was abusive and did a lot of things no 5-year-old should see. But when he married my mom and then adopted me and my sister, he became the only father I ever talk about.
Right.
And he too was my hero. But my dad, like, was not a man of a lot of words, but they were wise words when he spoke them.
Mhm.
And I was 18, getting ready to take a job that was going to take me to a big city in Florida. And I was scared because I grew up in a town of 7,000, and
Right,
we had 100 people in our class. The city over next to us had 4 people, so they could hold their reunion at the Denny's because
right.
it was, you know, it was small. But so I was scared, and it was also going to pay me a lot more than my dad made. My dad was also blue collar, worked at the local paper in spite of his pain and his issues. And so I was always worried about making more than my father because he raised 5 kids, blue collar, never bitched about his pain and his suffering and all this stuff. And so it really bothered me. Okay, I'm going to go make a lot of money and I'm going to have to leave my small town. And my father said, because I talked to my father like you did yours about everything. He said, if you don't make more than I do, I'm going to come kick your ass
Mhm.
because you need to make more than I did.
Yeah.
And, but then he also said, and this is where the small piece comes in. He said, never be afraid to go out in this world, wherever that takes you, because if you really need, I'm only a phone call away. And if you truly need, I'm only a plane ticket back.
Yeah.
And that gave me the freedom to just go and do and live life. And, I used to, in my early 20s, just throw a dart at a map and wherever it landed, that's where I'd move. Every couple of years, I'd go, okay, where's next?
Yeah.
And because of that one piece, it wasn't monumental, but it was monumental to me.
Yeah.
And so I think we have traveled similar type journeys and studied, similar type people and lived a similar type life, which is why I, really enjoy speaking with you because you're always bringing the insight and the wisdom, and you're always doing it from a giver's heart, which is always important to me. So um, ironically, you studied Tony Robbins, and then you got to be on this grand stage with Tony Robbins's partner, Dean Graziosi, and share your story with tens of thousands, if not millions of other people. And, so what's next for Bear Bangs?
It's actually really funny you should ask that because I'm asking myself that all the time. Uh, and I love it. I love asking that question because, and I talk about this with my wife a lot, having the freedom that I've kind of created for myself in a lot of ways. Like for me, the idea of a traditional job doesn't, yeah, right. It's shivers, right? Exactly. And so I'm like, I don't want one of those. But in that, it has created so many avenues, which is a curse, but also a blessing. Because
Mm-hmm.
when you have so many things out there that are available to you, it can sometimes give you that analysis paralysis where you
Yeah.
analyze all of those different options that are out there. For me, what's next is honestly just a continuation of what I'm doing. And that is that it's kind of a twofold approach. One, speaking belief into others, because we're in crisis right now as a society,
Mhm.
not just as in an American society, but a global society. There are so
True.
few people out there that believe in themselves and their abilities. And so it's that for me. It's continuing to, I made a commitment at the beginning of this year that I would do a video every single day of this year, whether it's, like this in a podcast form, or a 1 minute reel on Instagram or Facebook, or, longer form video, or different trainings that I do. It's that consistent piece of just giving. I'm not, someone actually called me out on it the other day. I did an Instagram post and I just said, or it was a reel, and I said, "How are you? Like, really, just how are you?" And this person commented and they're like, "Oh my gosh, what's next?" Just asking people how they are for likes. Oh my gosh. And so I actually responded. I took the time to respond, and I was like, actually, um, I apologize if my genuine concern for others is offensive to you. And he's like, "Well, you might as well just be an AI bot, because there's no meaning behind that." And I'm like, "Well, there is, because if you've watched any of my other stuff, you know that there's genuine meaning." And he's like, "Well, do you actually have conversations with people?" And I said, "Yeah, every single day."
Well,
I
we're
said,
having one now.
yeah,
Like,
I said, I check my messenger, or my messages every single day. If someone reaches out to me and needs something from me, I'm more than happy to provide whatever I can in that moment. So yeah, it is genuine. And then he comes back and he's like, "Oh, okay, well, thank you." And I'm like, "Okay, we're good." So yeah,
right.
um, but it is, that's what's next, is really continuing to create that consistency. I also made a goal that at the beginning of this year that I wanted to have a direct impact on 250 people in 2023. And whether that's paying clients, whether it's people who reached out to me that I have those direct messages with, whether it's the couples that I perform the wedding ceremonies for, that's a direct impact, because I love it. It's such an honor being a part of the beginning of people's happily ever after,
Yeah.
in whatever country they're in, whatever, wherever they are, with language barriers. I'm doing one in Mandarin tomorrow morning, but wherever they are in the world, there's one universal language, and that language is love. And so if I can be a part of that love for couples as they're starting that happily ever after, that's also a piece of what's next. So it's really just kind of coaching and marrying people is what I like to say.
Well, I am going to ask you two final questions because I've
Yeah.
enjoyed our time together. If you were to give advice, a piece of advice to some of the listeners out there who are also in the midst of their transformation and their struggle, what would be your directive to get them back on their track?
The biggest thing is, and you hear it a lot, and when it hits your soul, not just your heart, not just your brain, but when it hits your soul, take action on it. That's the biggest piece. Take some sort of positive action moving you in the direction that you want to move every single day, whether it's 6 inches or whether it's 60 miles. Just move in that direction that you want to go. A lot of times we as individuals are our own worst critics,
Mm-hmm.
and we don't give ourselves enough grace. We don't give ourselves enough credit. And it kind of goes back to when we were kids, don't brag about yourself. Don't
Mm-hmm.
be too proud of your accomplishments. Well, I tell people all the time, did you get up this morning? Did you get out of bed? Because for some people, that's a struggle on the daily, and
Mm-hmm.
sometimes there's just days where they struggle to get out of bed. Not every day, but there's some days.
Mm-hmm.
Did you get out of bed? Awesome. Pat yourself on the back. Give yourself that credit for doing something that you in that moment didn't feel like doing, but you did it anyway.
Absolutely.
That action and just keep moving forward.
Well, and that goes back to what your father and my father said, you don't get to choose which hands are dealt to you, but you do get to choose how you play them.
Yep, absolutely.
And every hand can be a winning hand if you choose to make it one.
Yeah.
So as we come to a conclusion, I ask every one of my guests, and you're part of my warrior spirit tribe. So what does having a warrior spirit mean to Bear Bangs?
For me, it is doing it in spite of whatever you're facing in that moment. It is just doing it. Uh, a lot of times people think that this warrior needs to be out there and, clad in armor and just taking on the world. And if that's what it means to somebody, great. But really, it just means there's going to be adversity. You're going to face an enemy. Whatever that enemy, whatever form that enemy takes, you're going to face that enemy. And it's about facing that enemy and just leading forward, leaning into it, and moving through whatever challenge and just getting to that other side of that enemy, getting to their back lines and just continuing to move forward no matter what adversity is staring you down.
That's perfect. That's exactly the essence that I created this warrior spirit group for, and I appreciate you. I love having you as a friend, and honored to call you as a brother. And I appreciate your time tonight, and continue to bless others. And thank you for blessing me with your time.
Thanks, Daryl. Appreciate you.
All righty. Good night.
Bye-bye.